Welcome back to Section 1. We have with us today in the deposition former Governor of the Central Bank, Mr. Jwala Rambarran. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
We're here to talk about recent amendments to the Central Bank Act, which I think a lot of commentators are saying really affects the independence of the bank and also, for the purpose of our show, our sovereign democratic state. Before we get into the amendment, generally, could you explain to our viewers what is the role of the central bank? We hear that there is a distinction between monetary and fiscal policy, the bank dealing more with monetary policy. But give us some nuts and bolts.
All right. Essentially, first thing is, a central bank is a unique institution in any country. There's only one.
Yeah.
Right.
And it shares, that means it also shares a very unique relationship with the government. And with that, there's been over the years a clear separation of economic functions and therefore powers between a central bank and the government. Now, we generally know the government is responsible for fiscal policy.
Right.
Fiscal policy relates to taxation, spending, and borrowing, essentially. That's what that is about, with a view to how you manage the economy on that front. Central banks generally deal with monetary policy, which means how you control the money supply, how you regulate credit, interest rates. But in our context, our central bank also carries a very heavy developmental role, and that has been traditionally since its inception, more than around, we're now looking around 55 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And therefore, our central bank is not only responsible for monetary policy, it is also the prime regulator in the financial system.
Yes.
So it regulates all the banks, all insurance companies, and all private pension funds.
Financial oversight.
Right?
And
So there's
oversight.
so it is the prime financial regulator.
Yeah.
With that in the system, the other two regulators are the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Intelligence Unit.
Yeah.
But those don't carry the kind of tremendous powers and resources and responsibilities like a central bank.
Right.
Now, again, in our context, our central bank manages the country's reserves.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? But it also manages the country's only sovereign wealth fund, which is the Heritage and Stabilization Fund.
Right.
Right? So that's additional responsibility on the central bank. The central bank is also banker to government, which is what all central banks are essentially. But that also carries a defining limit around how much credit could be given to government to finance its operations, right? And that's been a evolving role for central banks all over the world. Our central bank is also an economic advisor to the government, although not necessarily that you will take the advice of the central bank, right? But by virtue of its research department, which is the only such department that's housed with the best economists in the country, they have their pulse on what is actually happening in the economy. There's a lot of research, a lot of analysis, a lot of modeling that takes place. And out of that economic intelligence, what you get particular views and scenarios that the central bank could then take decisions on.
Right.
But that also means it now has the ability to also provide advice to the government on what their policies are, the consequences and impacts of their policies.
Right.
Right? The central bank also manages what we call the payment system, the national payment system. Right? So all your bank transactions, settling transactions with banks effectively is handled on the back end by the central bank. And then there's another part where because of the developmental role, our central bank has been responsible for what's called developing all the capital markets in Trinidad.
Right.
So the central bank is responsible for institutions like the Unit Trust Corporation, the Home Mortgage Bank, right? The Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance Company, right? And now you see the central bank moving now into the realm of what we call fintech, and starting to look at the possibility of how it could regulate and deal with these emerging issues on the technology side, right? So from that, you realize that this institution is actually critical to the economic health of our country.
So while we're on that, and you've laid out extensively, there are a lot of the roles of the central bank. independence means some type of insulation from executive or government. Let's use the word interference for now. Why is it important to keep those functions insulated, let's say, from government control or direct government control?
Right. All right. And partly to answer that means to look at where independence is along a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So some central banks will have sufficient autonomy to carry out all those functions with the government providing instructions dependent, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you'll have central banks that are fully independent and the government has no say.
No say.
Right? Our central bank is essentially somewhere right now. Well, legally, it was up to, I would say,
the way the
legally,
intention of the act was meant to work.
How it was meant to work. We were somewhere like in the middle.
In the middle, yeah.
Right? A middle ground that you have sufficient autonomy to carry out your monetary operations. Of course, you keep the, with consultation, you keep the Minister of Finance informed.
But there's a provision which says that if there's conflict.
If there's conflict, then the minister would issue an instruction. To the central bank. Now the thing is, and let's look, now that conflict is actually healthy, right? Because it comes to the heart of your question, why should there be, this level of independence of a bank? Because if you don't, then what's going to happen is that fiscal policy will dominate monetary policy totally. And therefore, then why have the need for this institution to carry through all these functions? Then make it a department of the Ministry of Finance.
Go into that a little bit. How would it start to dominate?
Because then what you would have is a minister now could say, well, I want to make use of the reserves. I want to make use of the Heritage and Civilization Fund. Now, while you could do that, I mean, remember in law there are fiduciary responsibilities attached especially to the governor. Right? And therefore, or they could say, well, I would like you to fund my deficit even more than what it is in law. Right? And there are other ways, and we've actually seen this particular government use that behind the scenes approach, and fund the deficit, right? So what it means is that effectively you are debasing, you then start over time to debase your currency, you start to interfere in the operations of the bank, you make it less independent, and therefore the kind of policy impact it would have starts to weaken over time. Now, and the thing is, we've seen this all over the world where governments decide we want to control central banks. And history has shown generally, is the final outcome? A massive wave of inflation that hits a country and decimates the population.
Political interference. It was really
because of a lack of independence of that institution.
Of that institution, right? And that is why you'll find around the world many countries have said, we will provide that level of independence. We will insulate you from the politicians so that you could do your job on our behalf. Right? And always remember, a central bank's role is about the national interest. Right? It's more medium to long term about how the country will evolve over time. Right? A politician's role is really about his interests, his political interests, and his short term within the cycle.
The politician, to be fair, would argue that he's also there to look at society. But he
yes,
has to be re-elected.
Right. And that's an argument that they always they always use, but it's not always the actions themselves don't square.
That's been our experience.
It does.
Well, while we're on individuals, at the top of the central bank sits the central bank governor. He has, I suppose, power, a lot of independent discretion and power by which he could take decisions. Of course, there's a board, but ultimately, it's as you could tell us as central bank governor, the central bank governor wields a lot of power in terms of the central bank.
The central bank governor wields a lot of power, and as I always say, with great power comes great responsibility. Right? And therefore, you have to be very careful about how you wield that power, and always remember, whatever decision you make must be a decision made in the interest of the country.
Yes.
Right? It cannot be in the interest of politicians.
And this is probably why I think the amendment has generated so much discussion, because the amendment goes to the root of the tenure. And of course, we know,
Yes.
Stefan and I could tell you, in terms of judges, security of tenure is
Tenure
very
is
important.
very important.
Very
Correct.
important.
Yeah.
But I mean, is that the same context with a central bank government?
Yes, when our Central Bank Act was put together, I always say the framers of that act were very visionary, right? Our act has really stood the test of time, particularly around the governance aspects of the act. It remains very strong. And that act essentially said we would give the governor a 5-year period.
Right.
And the intention was really and truly that you would have a governor who would kind of span out the electoral
Yes.
cycle.
Yeah.
And therefore, a governor would actually meet generally 2 administrations during his tenure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? And that is how it essentially worked for a while, right?
Yeah.
Well, especially after 1986. That's how it started to work. But the key part of that too is that it gave the governor a period of time to start to put whatever policies and programs that they think were suitable for where the bank needed to go and where the country needed to go. Because 5 years is more of a medium-term horizon versus a short horizon like essentially 3 years. 3 years is something by the time you start to put your things in place,
They finish.
They finish.
Yeah.
And now for the viewing audience, the amendment that was recently passed, the bill that was recently passed, the amendment to the Central Bank Act essentially changed the tenure from 5 years
So
to now a
essentially
period of 3 to 5
to
years.
5 years, right?
So now they could choose the period in which the
Yes.
central bank governor could
Right, and that is essentially what has happened now, is that, so this governor has now been reappointed, but for a period of 3 years.
3 years.
Yes.
And the question is, well, why?
Yeah.
Why? If he was good enough in the last 5 years,
To be
why
reappointed.
doesn't he get a
And
next
5 years.
5 years?
I mean,
And you-
critics would say potentially so that influence could be exerted over him. If you want your contract renewed,
Renewed,
Yeah.
right?
you have to go, yeah.
Right, so those are the questions that are starting to be asked, and I mean, you heard the minister and all talk about things like, well, that is important now for succession planning, but then that just simply reinforces the fact that, well, you now fully going to control, right,
Over the central bank.
the independence of the central bank.
Correct.
That was one of my
Yeah.
problems with it. I mean, ultimately, politicians are elected and they have a lot of discretion, and they, rightfully so, they have a democratic mandate. But my problem is, I really didn't hear any justification for this.
For this.
I understand why you would have 5 years, because you want to give security of tenure. But what was the problem? What was the mischief, as lawyers like to say when you make amendments? What was the mischief behind this amendment?
I mean, and respectfully, you can't you can't now go on and say, well, we are going for this amendment simply because you want to have a succession plan in place.
No, it's-
I mean, that as you said,
Is
it's
there
a
any
slow
mischief that
erosion.
you could see?
Yeah.
Well, to begin with, let's deal with this succession plan story, right? First, so we seem to forget, and the population seems to forget, there's a central bank board,
Right.
Yes.
right? Don't we all know that the issue of succession planning, right, at the level, right, of the executive is left to the board,
To the board.
Yes.
to do?
Yeah.
Why is the minister now interfering
Involving,
inside succession planning for the central bank?
For a purported
Right?
independent institutions.
Independent institution. The second thing is the history has shown that generally the deputy governors would come from within the central bank, but the governor would be someone who comes from outside. And that is simply, a part of that was simply because you give the you get a different perspective, right? So it's not only somebody who is familiar with the institution, you have somebody with a different point of view, and that makes for a good mix at the top.
Right.
Right? The second thing is that the governor is also the chairman of the board, as well as CEO of the organization.
Yeah.
So when you tell him, well, you no longer responsible for succession planning, and the minister is responsible, then that is not good corporate governance.
No,
Of course.
it's not.
That goes against the grain of what we know to be, right, proper corporate
It
governance.
could affect apprenticeship, it could affect training,
Yeah.
it could affect identifying talent.
And you also heard the minister say yesterday that, so he went out to do an international search and he couldn't find people who were willing to come to the central bank and serve? Well, the reason is clear,
Because
right? Because why would someone, right, and we have really good people outside, right?
Yeah, of course.
Why would they say no to coming back to serve in such a prestigious, right, and powerful position? Simply because they don't want to get tainted
Yeah.
with that political stigma that will come onto them.
They don't want to be
and they don't want to be,
operating
yeah.
under.
And you're going to ask them now to be accountable for an organization, right, when they may not have the power, right?
Yes.
To run
That,
things
to
as they
run
see.
things as they see fit, and that goes with the accountability.
Do you see this as, I mean, we once had the term in our history, the term called creeping dictatorship. Do you see this as some type of pattern or trend to slowly wither away at all independence of the central bank?
Well, I think it's more than only the central bank. I think what you're going to start to see is that it's control of all the national institutions.
Yeah, independent.
The independent institutions.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you guys have been discussing the Concordat.
Yes.
And the Concordat is an institution. When you think
correct.
of what an institution is, right?
correct.
Yes, you know it as an agreement, but it's an institution by itself.
Yes.
And now you have this, right?
Encroachment.
This encroachment, this attack on the Concordat,
Yeah.
right?
Procurement, I think.
You have the attack on the procurement regulator,
Regulator.
and the office of the procurement, right? Regulation. So you have these, and these are institutions that are supposed to be set up to help create and balance out the national good.
Correct.
Right? So this latest salvo on the central bank is just part of a continuing trend.
Yeah.
Now, the amendment is what we see now today, but you've had previous amendments over the last few years. The amendment before that last year was when the minister made the amendment to the Central Bank Act. So he could now come in and demand the confidential files of any central bank employee, past and present.
Why would he want
Right? Well, somebody should ask the minister, why would he want to, why does he want to have this information?
Why does that power exist?
Yeah.
Right? Why would you give a political creature, right, the confidential files of employees?
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Past and present.
Yeah, past and present.
Yes.
Retroactive.
Yeah, right? So, I mean, these are things that I think this must be troubling to the national community. It must be, because it shows that we're moving in a direction that's extremely dangerous. I mean, you've used the term creeping dictatorship. I think we passed the point of creeping.
Galloping.
Yeah, right? We have the galloping. And then there was another amendment to the Central Bank Act about 2 years ago, Christmas time, if I remember. And what they did was to raise the borrowing limit from the central
15
bank.
to 20.
From 15 to 20. Right? So based on the level of expenditure, you could now borrow additional anywhere between $5 to $10 billion from the central bank.
Central bank,
Yeah, no questions asked.
Right.
Right? And
Has that historically ever been changed?
No, that's all right, and that's the next point I was going to come to.
Yeah.
At the depth of our economic downturn, right? During the late 1980s, when we were into the IMF program in the early 90s, no government saw it fit to make any adjustment. Right? So at what was our worst period in our economic history, it wasn't done. And yet this administration has decided, well, we're going to change it.
Yeah.
And it's quite possible that it will also change again.
Yeah.
Right? And now, and added to that is the fact that they went in and raided the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So it actually, and that's another institution.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
That's another institution. So it shows that there's no respect for national institutions.
Yes. Seems that political ambition seem to be order of the day.
Order of the day.
Now, Senator Mark he made a very interesting statement, which sort of had my mind thinking about. He said that it would be very dangerous if fiscal policy and monetary policy, there was no distinction between it. I mean, as an economist, I don't know if you could pick up on what he was trying to say there.
Yeah, it's not. Well, it's not that there wouldn't be a distinction, right? It's clear what is fiscal and it's clear what is monetary.
Yeah.
But it's in relation to the goals and objectives of the government, as I've said. So what would happen is that there would be dominance now over monetary policy.
I see.
Right? So essentially, let's say in its after the central bank had done its research, its analysis, as it does every quarter, and decides that it needs to raise the repo rate, right, which is its policy rate, right, because it needs to, for whatever reason, it needs to protect the balance of payments. It thinks higher interest rates are now supposed to be more important in the system, right? And now that is supposed to be totally independent of the political directorate, right? Once the central bank takes that decision, it takes that decision, right? As a matter of fact, the way how this thing is done is that even the board of the central bank is not told what is going to be, the policy change. What they are told is what are the conditions in economy, what are the influencing factors, right? And that a decision will be made.
But not specifically
that. But they're not told specifically, and there's a reason why, right? There's a reason why this thing is kept, right, under wraps until the announcement is made. Because if you had this information beforehand, then you have insider information and you could take particular positions. Right? And therefore this thing is kept, right, under wraps, as I say. It's not even told to the board until an announcement is made and everybody is then made aware of what it is. So what happens when the Minister of Finance says, well, I hear you guys are going to, right, move this rate? No, I don't want it moved. Leave it right there. Well, what's the purpose of monetary policy then?
Exactly. That is really a decision that should be taken by the specialists in the field, as opposed to the political considerations.
Well, the deputies and the governor.
Yes, who are taking a view, right, of where they see things evolving and what is right for the country. That's what I tell you. When you take a decision, any decision taken in the central bank is a decision that must be taken, right, with a view as to what is right, considered right for the country. Now, they might be wrong in making decision after a while, but at least they're not going to be influenced by the politics.
It's their decision. It's their decision based on their forecasted.
One of the arguments put against that view is that, look, the central bank, we're in a democracy. The central bank is a very important and powerful institution, as you have said, but there's no political accountability of the central bank. The head of the central bank isn't elected. Is that a viable argument?
There's some truth to that, right? And partly this is where we need to go as a country, in that given the tremendous powers of the central bank, there obviously has to be a greater level of accountability and transparency. Now, the way how the central bank fulfills that role, right, because it hasn't abdicated that role at all, is that you will see it will put out a number of reports on the economy. So you'll have like the economic bulletin, you'll have your annual economic survey, you'll have your financial stability report, your monetary policy report. So it is actually reporting to the national community, right? And therefore that level of accountability and transparency is there.
Are those reports laid in Parliament? Or
no, they made available. The annual report would be laid in Parliament, right? Because that's a requirement. Now the other part is this. When I was there, what I did to add to that layer of transparency and accountability was I introduced what was called a monetary policy forum, where the governor now would come and stand to the national community and report and speak on this is where we see things, where we are now, this is how we see it evolving, and these are the factors that we have to consider over this next period of time until I come back to report. Right? And then I would take questions.
Has that been
that has been scrapped.
Right.
Since you're no longer there.
That has been scrapped. But it is an important part of a central bank providing that level of accountability and transparency to the national community. Right? And as I say, it's part of the evolving role of a central bank, where other central banks have taken this and solidified this and codified this to the point where their reporting goes straight to the parliament. Right, before a joint select committee.
I mean, finally, well, do we report to a joint select committee?
No.
Finally, do you, I mean, we've had a long discussion. Do you see the need for more legislative protection, maybe even constitutional protection for the central bank?
Yes. Actually, what we need to do is to do a full reform of the Central Bank Act, right, to bring it more in line with what is required in these modern times for transparency and accountability and good governance, right? Not what we see now, which is actually going backwards.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Because what we're seeing is a full regression
Yeah.
Yeah.
on governance, on accountability, and on transparency.
Yep.
Right? And a lot of countries, I mean, if we look at just what's happening right up the road with Jamaica,
Right.
Jamaica has actually put forward legislation, and they will be strengthening the independence of their central bank and insulating it even more
Yeah.
from the political directorate.
Yeah.
Right? And what will happen is that with that change, the central bank governor will now appear before a joint select committee and report on his performance.
And
the
that goes
performance of the
towards,
bank.
and that again goes towards transparency.
So you have a nice balance between giving them independence, but also increasing the
accountability.
Yeah, that's a good model.
Yeah.
And that's a brilliant model because it shows the regression that you have explained today. That it shows with our central bank. You show just up the road in Jamaica, they're moving steps away from us.
And I'm sure there are other models around the world.
There are other models around the world, but there are a lot. They'll be in that direction that Jamaica has gone. There are other central banks that go so 100% independent. They no longer, the executive has no say.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely no say.
Are
And
there
they simply
models-
account to their
Are
parliament.
there models where the bank is totally under control of the government that you know of?
Yes, Trinidad and Tobago.
Maybe we should leave it there.
We should leave it there.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I want to
You're
thank
welcome.
our guest, the former governor,
Yeah.
Mr. Rambarran. We'll be right back with we'll be discussing on the Soapbox segment with Ms. Sheila Dines.